Welcome to The Design Of, a new series where I analyze how design choices in video games express a full narrative through gameplay, sound design, and character design. To kick this series off, I'm going to talk about my main character from the Tekken series, Bryan Fury.
Bryan Fury wins.
Bryan Fury debuted in Tekken 3 back in 1997. He's a former police detective that almost dies in a shootout but was rescued from the verge of death and partially resurrected into a cyborg by Dr. Abel. Dr. Abel forced Bryan to do his dirty work and quickly abandoned him in his promise of fully resurrecting Bryan shortly after. With the little life Bryan has left to live, he goes on a desperate rampage as he looks for new options to prolong his life while enacting revenge on everyone, mowing down anyone who dares cross his path. Bryan's character after his death in the narrative is fully reflective in his moveset, playstyle, and game plan. Tekken directly encourages and rewards you for fully embodying Bryan Fury's lust for revenge during matches. As a Bryan player, you want your opponent dead by any means necessary, but you need to do it on your own terms to make everyone suffer for your death. You enjoy watching your opponent fold by outsmarting them with an endless but methodical barrage of brutal attacks as Bryan. From a narrative standpoint, both of Bryan's lives as an observant police detective and a bloodthirsty cyborg out for revenge are reflected in his gameplay. Bryan's main overarching goal narratively is to destroy everything. He wants to pummel everyone and everything until it can't bleed any longer, but from a gameplay standpoint, his optimal range is actually at the mid-range, which is counterintuitive to his character. Why is this? From a gameplay balance standpoint, it's so the player has to put in extra effort to get in and counter hit the opponent.
Oh, counter hit. What?
Bryan's biggest weakness is being pressured himself, so being in your opponent's face with no information at the offensive is difficult for Bryan and the player to manage. He and the player are constantly risking their lives with slow, committal, but devastating moves throughout the match.
Let's end it off. That new...
From a narrative standpoint though, I'd argue it's due to Bryan's background as a detective. Because Bryan has such hard-hitting and slow moves, Bryan players must actively watch and scope out ways to exploit their opponent's habits and weaknesses with pokes and a lot of patience at the mid-range for the perfect time to begin his assault on them. Bryan players are constantly looking for new information on their opponents to exploit with every move, and they're having a conversation with themselves the same way a detective would. Throughout the match, they're thinking things like, they have a bad habit of trying to go in at this exact timing. They always freeze up when I do this move, or if I sidestep this move, I can fully launch punish them. Bryan players use this information they've gathered throughout the match to slowly but brutally condition the player into respecting them to fight on their terms, inflicting the same fear and despair Bryan felt the day that he died as the match wanes in his favor. As for his approach tools, Bryan can get in the opponent's face in a few ways that really fit his character. Either by reversing the offensive to be in his favor, by using a calculated counter hit or whiff punish, or by every Bryan player's dream scenario, with a complete submission of your opponent out of fear. Bryan's entire game plan revolves around using mind games and a concept called mental frame traps to coerce the opponent into fearing and respecting him. Once Bryan players smell that fear, their reign of terror can begin. Once Detective Bryan gains the information he needs to fully exploit you, he can and will annihilate you and your entire health bar. At close range, he practically shifts personalities in his game plan, which is reflected through the overwhelming weight and strength of his most powerful moves. Bryan's strongest moves are plus, counter-hit opponents who refuse to respect him, or a combination of both, which allow him to continue the latent, revenge-induced rampage he's worked towards the entire match. Getting hit by Hatchet Kick, Bryan's staple low, is a great example of how Bryan's sound and character design inflicts fear and aggression into both players. Bryan players know the absolute bliss of hearing this move connect. The brutal whip sound effect of Hatchet Kick literally creates a Pavlovian response into Bryan players to continue their aggression. In general with Bryan, the better the player is, the louder and more sadistic Bryan's sound effects and voice lines become. Just as Bryan enjoys the sport of the slaughter, so will the player. These design choices create empathy and allow the player to feel what Bryan feels through his gameplay. Hatchet Kick represents what Bryan commands in his game plan, full domination of both the physical and mental will of his opponents. The act of repeatedly using Hatchet Kick on your opponent is essentially taunting your opponent by saying, I know you're scared of me, I command you to kneel down, do exactly what I say, and duck this move. And if they're stupid or afraid enough to submit and listen, you can destroy them with punishing mid-hitting moves and launchers. The type of opponents that will be able to defeat Bryan are those that are confident and unwavering in their ability to fall under Bryan's pressure and read his unpredictable nature. Speaking of taunting your opponent, Bryan has a difficult to use but unpredictable move called the taunt that, with enough experience and execution from the player's side, allows Bryan to brute force defensive players to take damage or even a full combo. Everything about this move conveys the focus of Bryan's character. The input for taunt 1 + 3 + 4 is extremely intentional. There's next to no way you're hitting that on accident, and you have to go well out of your way to execute it. which is exactly what taunting someone is, dropping your guard to humiliate your opponent, encouraging or forcing them to act. In order to fulfill his dying wish, Bryan wants to not only physically destroy his opponents, but mentally destroy them as well, which is why he uses such a powerful but difficult maneuver in battle. He wants you from the bottom of your heart to feel the despair of getting hit and outsmarted by such a slow and unorthodox move against your will. And what better way to do that than by getting hit by a frame-perfect taunt jet upper. Once the opponent is conditioned and placed to the wall, the mechanical execution of combo wonders from the player embodies the joy that Bryan himself feels from cornering his opponent. Many of Bryan's combo wonders at the wall require the player to rapidly and precisely mash buttons to execute them, which feels absolutely incredible to do. After the process of slowly scouting, exploiting, and carrying your opponents to the wall, you can finally deliver an explosion of damage followed by a fuck you, punch, or knee into even more pressure, or even a taunt setup to further humiliate them. If the opponent exudes fear and mashes their tech roll in the corner to get up as soon as possible, Bryan can call them out and force them into another unblockable wall combo using his taunt. But calm and unwavering players can avoid this by staying on the ground, which goes back to my point earlier. The names of many of Bryan's key moves also convey his character and personality. We've already talked about Hatchet Kick, which evokes a really gruesome image in and of itself. He also has numerous snake motifs in his moveset, which is exactly what Bryan reflects in the story and his gameplay. Bryan is constantly stalking his opponent for the perfect time to strike, just like a snake, and even betrays people the same way that a figurative snake does. For example, Yoshimitsu saved him in Tekken 4, and Bryan proceeded to turn around and massacre his entire Manji clan out of petty revenge. His devastating low launcher, Snake Edge, completely avoids highs and even some mids while sticking close to the ground like a, well, you get the idea. I'd also argue that many of his moves on an arcade stick feel like you're slithering in a way, with many of them whipping or slowly sliding in opposite directions of each other. The animations for his quarter circle forward slide and his back sway even visually look like a slithering snake, to further add to this theme. Bryan's character theme from Tekken 3 to me evokes the feeling of being pursued by a cyborg. The heart of the track is a drum and bass loop, which in itself is representative of artificial life. For the most part, drum and bass drum breaks are completely programmed and synthesized rather than sampled from existing recordings of live drum breaks like in the genre of jungle music. This reflects the way that Dr. Abel gave him artificial life. His soul isn't fully there, just like these programmed drum breaks, instead replaced by a cold, consistent, and calculated mind for revenge. The droning, chaotic synths and pads throughout the song sound like lasers in industrial atmosphere, which is also what Bryan Fury is all about. Hey, thanks for watching. With this new series, I wanted to try to branch out and do some shorter videos in different genres I like, so if you stuck around to the end, I really appreciate it. If you like narrative and music analysis, that's pretty much all I do on this channel, so check out my other stuff. I'll catch y'all in the next video. Take care, be easy.